In this lesson, we are going to talk about the state that NGRX is holding. You can find a full lesson in the following link, academies.com, EN, course, Angular, NGRX State. If you visit this site, you'll notice you have the full lesson summary in the site, along with a video of the lesson and the code example located at the right. So let's start learning about the state of NGRX. About the NGRX state, what do I mean when I say NGRX state? What I mean by NGRX state is the data that is currently held by NGRX. The state is the data that NGRX is holding. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about that NGRX state, things you need to know about this state, as well as best practices and how to maintain that state. And we'll start by looking at a simple demo of a counter application. This counter application is created with Angular and NGRX. NGRX is holding the counter data, and as you click a button, that counter is incremented by 1. A really simple app, and you can find this app in our lesson site, EN course Angular NGRX State. I'll post the link to the lesson site in the description of the video, and I have this site is the link here. You can click here to see the code of this demo as well as examine the site itself. We're not focused on the code itself, rather we're going to only look at the counter app with the developer tools that displays on the right that shows me what is the state that NGRX holding. So I have this Angular application created by Angular and NGRX, and on the right side I can examine the state that NGRX is holding. As I click the increment button, I can see that the state on the right is incremented, as well as the components that are connected to that state. So based on this app, we're going to try to reach conclusions about that state that NGRX is holding. So based on the demo that we just saw of the counter app, let's examine the state that we just saw. So the state that NGRX is holding in the counter app looks like this. It's a simple object with a counter key, and the value is the number of times you click on that button. Now, a few facts that we can notice based on that demo of the counter app. One fact about the state in NGRX is that the state that NGRX is holding is a simple JavaScript object. We noticed when we look at the Redux Dev tools that the state is a simple object. If you don't see it as a simple object, you might need to switch in here to the raw view, and then you see that the state is a simple object. Now, the object, as we mentioned before, it's really simple, has a key counter, and the value is the number of times you click the button. Also, the state has an initial value. This is another characteristic of the state in NGRX. The state in NGRX starts with a certain value. In our case, if you reload the app and you do not click the button, just reload the app, you see that the state is starting with a counter of 0. So the state of NGRX has an initial value, and in our case, that initial value is 0, starts with counter 0. Now notice that the initial value does not mean that your state in the app has to be fixed and looks like this. It doesn't mean that in your entire Angular application you have to have only the counter key. It's common that if you load a lazy module that needs the NGRX state, that lazy module will add additional data in a lazy fashion. And you can also add data yourself and remove data. So the data is also dynamic. The initial state does not mean that the structure of the state has to look the same everywhere in your Angular app. So the state has an initial value. The state in NGRX is immutable. This is probably the most important fact that you have to remember about the state in NGRX. You cannot change the state, you have to replace it. This means that if you want to change the counter in the current state, you cannot access the current state counter and increment that counter by 1. You have to replace the entire object with a new object containing a counter with greater value. You cannot just change a key, you need to replace the entire object in the state in NGRX. So NGRX is immutable, which means we do not change the state, rather we completely replace the state that NGRX is holding. So just to emphasize about this important fact that the state in NGRX is immutable, things that you do not do is you do not grab the state. Here is a simple example of pseudocode. It's not real code. It's not how you change the NGRX state, or it's not something that relates to NGRX, simply relates to what we mean by immutability. So what you do not do is you do not take the state like for in this example, the state which has a counter of 0, you do not grab the NGRX state and then grab the counter key and change that key. This means that you're mutating the state, and you do not do that in NGRX. What you are going to do with the NGRX state is going to keep it immutable by using the spread operator. So in this example, we have the old state, which holds the counter. To generate a new state, what I'm doing is I'm taking the old state and I'm using the spread operator to copy all those fields that I'm not changing, and then I'm overriding the fields that I do want to change. So in this example, we use the spread operator to copy all the fields. Although we don't really have additional fields in this example, usually in NGRX states you're holding much more information. So it is useful. Usually in our case, in our simple case, you can also not use the spread operator. But in general, in most cases, what you will do is use the spread operator to copy all those fields from the state and use the spread operator to construct a completely new object and then override those fields that you want to change. Here we kept the state immutable. We did not change the state. Rather, we created a new state from the old state without actually changing the state and keeping the state in NGRX immutable. NGRX is implemented using RXJS. This means that you have to look at things from the lens of RxJS. You need to look at state change like an observable that emits a new state. So you need to look at the state change like you have an observable, and that observable, every time the state is changing, is emitting a new state. And if we examine the source code of NGRX, we'll notice that the service that is holding the state, the store, which we'll talk about in future lessons, that store extends observable. So you have to look at things at state change like an observable that emits the new state every time the state is changing. It's recommended that you keep the state in NGRX as a serializable object. A serializable object means that you can take that object, you can convert it to string, for example, by using JSON stringify. You can then take that string, you can convert it back to an object, for example, using JSON parse, and you will get a similar object without losing data. This means an object is serializable. Basically, it means that your object, to keep it serializable, need to be constructed from primitives and from object array containing primitives. Those object array can of course contain additional object arrays that contain primitives, but basically primitives and object array containing primitives. Stuff that will ruin an object from being serializable. If you store, for example, class instances and you have methods in that class instances, that will ruin your object being serializable. Also, functions will cause your object not to be serializable. And the thing is, your app might work if you store class instances and function in your NGRX state, but stuff that might be damaged, or for example, time travel might be damaged. Time travel means that in the Redux DevTools, you can see the state change, and time travel means you can go back in time and you can see the state changes in a period of time, and you see also the components are updated. So that time travel might be damaged if your object is non-serializable. Also, if you plan to store the state in NGRX, for example, store it in database or store it in local storage in order to restore the user back to the original state that he left your application from. If you want to do that, restore the user from the state. If you don't have a serialized object, you'll have difficulty of saving it correctly. So this will be damaged as well. In general, it's recommended to keep your state in NGRX as a serialized object. So to clarify what we mean with pseudocode, what you shouldn't do in the NGRX state is take the NGRX state and populate it, for example, with a function or with a class. This makes your state in NGRX non-serializable. What you should do in your state, it stores with objects, for example, user with first name and last name, which are strings. You can populate it with array, with object, and those objects contain simple strings or number or boolean or primitive. So this is a serializable object. What you saw before with a class and a function, this makes your NGRX state non-serializable. Try to keep your NGRX state as a serializable object. To help us understand more facts about the NGRX state, let's look at another demo of Angular and NGRX. This is the book application, and in this application we have a login screen, and after you type your credential, you move to the book list screen where you can enter books. So let's take a look at this example. This example also in the lesson site, academies.com, EN course, Angular, NGRX State. In the lesson site, you'll find the link to the code of this example in the right side of the lesson. I have it open here, so let's open this. This is the book application. This is the Redux DevTool where we can examine the NGRX state of this application. Let's enter a first name and last name. we see that the user is populated, and then we have also another populated section in the state, a books section with a list of our created books. We can add a book, and then that book will be added to the list. We can add a few books, and we have those books added to NGRX. We can time travel back to see the books that we added, time travel forward. So we'll examine this application and the state in this application to understand additional facts about the NGRX state. Something we can notice from watching the book application is the fact that the state in NGRX should be organized. The state in NGRX is not a global variable that you just throw arbitrary data without logic or without order. It needs to be organized. My guess is before you use a state management library, now when you're not using a state management library, you probably are using services to store your data, to interact with the server. So if you had a certain service to hold the user of your application and to interact with the user API, you probably had a user service. If you had a book section in your app storing books and interacting with the book server, you probably had a book service. So just like before you used NGRX, you had some kind of logical thinking when ordering your data, when organizing your data in your application. The same rule applies with NGRX state. The state should be organized and enforced with an interface. So you're not just throwing an arbitrary data in an object, you are organizing that data to a section, in our example, to a section of user and to a section of books, where each one of them will talk about later in the chapter. You have a reducer that is in charge of each section of the state. We'll talk about reducers in later lessons in this chapter. But overall, your state is not a big mess. It's an organized object. The state in your application is not something that stays in a certain structure. The state is something that is alive and dynamic and changing as the user moves along in your application. Yes, you start the state with some kind of initial state, but often, for example, an often use case that happens is when your user navigates the application, certain modules might be lazy loaded. And sometimes those lazy loaded modules want to add data, want to add sections to the state. So often the data that they add to the state will be lazy loaded as well. So data in the state can change, can be added, can be removed, and you start with the initial state, but it not necessarily means that the structure will stay like the initial state. For example, in the book application, we start with the initial state of user equals null, and that is the only key we have in the state. Now in this application, we have a lazy loaded module that displays the books, and the data of that lazy loaded module is lazy loaded as well. So that data doesn't appear now in the state. Only after I log in can I see the data in NGRX, and the data is lazy loaded as well. So the data is changing, the structure of the state is changing. You can add section, if you can remove section if you want to preserve memory, and structure of the state does not stay the same throughout the entire life of the user in your application. Before we can understand and work with NGRX, a state management library, we have to understand the state part. What is that state that NGRX is holding? Facts, best practices, and information we need to know about that state. And that is what we covered in this lesson. We learned that the state is a simple JavaScript object, and we give that object an initial value. The state is immutable. You cannot change the state in NGRX. You have to replace the state every time you want to make a change in the state. The NGRX is implemented using RXJS. So imagine NGRX like an observable which emits a state every time the state is changed. So it emits the initial value, then emits counter 1, counter 2. It emits the new state every time the state is changing. So NGRX is implemented using RxJS. State should be serializable. So don't store class instances, don't store functions in your state. Try to make it serializable with primitives and with object array containing primitives. State should be organized, so it's not a big global variable. It should be organized to sections according to the logic in your application. Each section have a reducer which is in charge of that section. That organization need to be enforced with an interface. State is also dynamic, something that is alive and changing as your user interacts with your application. Lazy loaded modules often will load lazy loaded data in the state. You can add data to the state as well as remove data from the state. That's it. Thank you for joining about the NGRX state. Let's move along to the next lesson.